special story for Grace people. If you remember the Grace course and how we got our name, it's very special. Anyway, to illustrate the point further, Jesus told them this story. A man had 2 sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now, before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land. And there he wasted all his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding to the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. So he returned home to his father. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. But his father said to the servants, Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet, and kill the fatted calf we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found. So the party began. Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working, and when he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house. And he asked one of the servants, what was going on? Your brother is back, he was told, and your father has killed the fattened calf. We are celebrating because of his safe return. The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. His father came out and begged him, but he replied, all these years I've slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to. And in all that time you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours comes back after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fattened calf. His father said to him, look, dear son, you have always stayed by me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he is found.
Thank you, Liz, for reading that amazing story. Just before I start speaking this morning, up to date news. Ali was saying there were some more Ukrainian friends in the pipeline, but actually up to date, Ksenia has arrived just last Sunday, and her and her two children will be living with Mark and Carol Glover. So Ksenia, you're so welcome. We're so glad that you're with us, and we pray that God will bless you richly. When Jesus was on earth, he often spoke into the cultural and religious norms of the time, the things that people had accepted as the way things were always going to be, in terms of what God's kingdom is like, and who is welcome to God, and what God is like. And Jesus lived on earth to show us what God is actually like. He spoke often about what God was like and what the kingdom of God is like. And often that brought him into conflict with the religious leaders of the time. And this morning we read a story of how Jesus shared into a particular situation. And it was a particular situation, and it's mentioned at the very beginning of the chapter. We didn't read that bit. But Luke 15 verse 1 says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering round to hear him," that's Jesus. "But the Pharisees and teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" And Jesus spoke into that situation with these two very different groups of people standing listening to him: the tax collectors and sinners, the Pharisees and teachers of the law. See, tax collectors were shunned by really everybody in society. They worked in cahoots with the Roman occupying force and collected taxes from the Jewish people, from their Jewish neighbours. But worse than that, they pocketed a fair amount of that too, and so were becoming rich off the backs of their Jewish friends and neighbours. And so they were viewed as traitors. Everybody shunned them. The sinners, the Greek word is hamartolos. And it's literally meaning people who miss the mark. It's used in competition sport. So people who miss the mark, and the idea is they've missed out on the prize because they've missed the mark. They've fallen short. They haven't hit the target. But these hamartolos, you'll see it in some of your versions, has the wee quotations marks around it, because their lives were characterised by missing the mark. Their whole lives were about missing the mark. They were characterised as sinners. And the religious leaders shunned them. They got the message loud and clear that they were not welcome. They could not be in God's family. They weren't welcome amongst the religious community. They were shunned and cast out. And Jesus speaks into this situation. The Pharisees didn't even walk on the same side of the street as these sinners and tax collectors. They certainly wouldn't speak to them. And eating with them, in Middle Eastern culture, that is so much more than just a meal together. That's so much more than what you would do with just an acquaintance. If you invite someone into your home, or if you go to someone's home and eat with them, you're accepting them as an honoured friend. Not just an acquaintance, an honoured friend. And so the Pharisees, who wouldn't even give these people the time of day, are muttering because Jesus is he's not shunning these people. In fact, he's welcoming them as his honoured friends. And that would have been deeply offensive to the Pharisees. But Jesus doesn't apologise for this. In fact, he doubles down and he tells 3 stories to illustrate the point that God welcomes everyone. And we're not going to unpack all the stories, but very briefly, the first story is about a lost sheep. And we all know the story of how the shepherd gathers all the sheep together at the end of the day and discovers one is missing. Now, he has 100 sheep, You could be forgiven to think, well, you know, what's one sheep? But this shepherd, that's not how he reacts. He knows the sheep is in danger. It's dark, there are wild animals about. And he cares for that sheep. A beautiful picture. He cares for the one sheep. And so without any thought for his own safety and his own comfort, he leaves the other 99 sheep safely and goes out to search for the one. That's such an amazing picture of God, who is interested in the one. He's a God who doesn't mind getting his hands dirty. He goes into those deep, dark, dirty places where the one is lost. And he searches for them desperately because they matter to him. The one matters to God. Jesus died for the whole world, yes, but the one matters to God. He doesn't see us just as a collective group of people. This sheep didn't even realise it was lost. It had just wandered off, doing its own thing. It didn't realise the danger that it was in. It wasn't a willful sheep. It just got lost. And look, the shepherd went out looking for it. See, God always takes the initiative. He's out searching for us. He doesn't wait for us to come to him. He's out searching for us. And when there's a stirring in your heart, or somebody says something to you, or you see something on the TV, or you're reading the Bible and something stirs in your heart, that is God. That is God's Spirit searching for you. And when he finds the sheep, he brings it home, and Jesus says, all heaven rejoices over one sinner that is brought home. And then Jesus tells a second story about a woman who loses a coin. And she searches desperately for it. She pulls the house apart. She pulls out all the furniture. She lights a lamp. She sweeps and sweeps and sweeps like a crazy person, just looking for that little glint that tells her where the coin has fallen. Now, we don't know what this coin was actually worth. I think that's amazing. Somehow in the annals of time, the actual denomination of this coin has got lost. Some Bible scholars think this could have been worth up to a month's wages. So, yeah, you definitely won't find that. Some think that actually it was worth very little. It would be ridiculous. It's like tearing your house apart for the sake of 5p. Some think that it may actually have been the coin that she wore on her wedding headdress when she was married, and so maybe very little monetary value, but immense sentimental value. The bottom line is, we don't know what the coin was actually worth. There's one thing we know for sure though. It was very valuable to her. It had immense value to this woman. See, people put different values on us. Some people value others greatly. Some put a very low value on others. At the end of the day, what matters most is that God values you greatly. This little coin wasn't a willful coin either. It didn't intend to get lost. It just fell between the cracks. And there are people in our society today just like that. They've just fallen between the cracks. And nobody notices them, and nobody cares about them. They just lift right out. Maybe even there's someone who feels like that here this morning. You feel unnoticed. Can I tell you from the heart of God this morning, He notices you. He's searching for you. He's sweeping and sweeping and looking for that little glint that says, I found this coin that is precious, And then Jesus goes on to tell another story, and it's a story that we read this morning. The story of the prodigal son, and it's such a well-known story. The son who goes to his father and asks for his share of the inheritance. Now, when Jesus was telling that story, at this point, there would have been gasps from his listeners, because this was a dreadful, dreadful thing. I mean, in our culture, in our society, if you go to your father and say, actually, I'd really like, an advance on my inheritance, that's still a wee bit dodgy, sort of thing. I mean, but in Middle Eastern culture, that's a dreadful thing. This is very much an honour, shame-based culture. And to disrespect a father like this is a shameful thing, a terrible thing. He was basically saying to his father, I wish you were dead. What an awful thing. What an awful thing. This son wanted nothing to do with his father. What the father should have done is given him a beating at least, thrown him out of the house, and never spoken his name again. That was what was acceptable in Middle Eastern culture. His name would never have been mentioned in the household again. He was dead to them. But that's not what this father does. He gives him what he has asked for. And what does the son do with it? He takes it and goes into a far country. He wanted to get as far away from his father's influence as he could. This was a son who had made a decision. He was rejecting his father. He didn't want anything to do with him. He didn't want to be under his influence, happy to take his money, but didn't want him to have any influence over his life at all. He wanted to live his life on his terms. He willfully rebelled and rejected his father. And once he's far away, he wastes his money on bad, shameful things. And even when the money's gone, he still doesn't really have a thought for his father. But then famine strikes the land. And he has to get a job feeding pigs just to get something to eat. And so this Jewish young man hits rock bottom. See, feeding the pigs in a Gentile foreign country is the lowest of the low. This makes him now unclean. And for Jesus' listeners, he would be beyond the pale. This young man is now beyond redemption. But it's in his desperation, finally, his thoughts turn towards home. And sometimes it's only in our desperation that we turn to God. We're happy enough to continue our own lives on our terms, but it's when that bad diagnosis happens. When a marriage falls apart, when we lose our job, and the fabric of our lives that we've so carefully woven together starts to unravel. And then we start to ask the difficult questions in life. What is life really about? Is there more to life than this? Is there a God at all? And if there is he interested in me? And in his desperation, the son decides to head for home. But notice, even now, he still wants to do this on his own terms. He acknowledges he's not worthy to be a son anymore. That would not have been a shock to Jesus' listeners. But he says, his plan is, he's going to say, make me like one of your hired servants. He still thinks he can work things out himself. But before he reached home, the father saw him coming. Now, in my mind, I used to see this in a very cinematic way, like a big, long, winding road through the open countryside to the big house sitting on its own on a hill. And the father would look out and see the son coming, and then he would run to him. In actual fact, that's probably not how it would have happened, because houses, they didn't tend to build houses away out on their own. They tended to build houses together in a community. So in reality, this son would have been doing a walk of shame in front of all his neighbours, who knew exactly what he had done and who judged him for it. He would have had to endure the looks, the stares, maybe even worse, the taunts and abuse of people who were disgusted by him. And when the father saw him coming, he couldn't bear the thought of his son doing that walk of shame on his own. His heart was bursting with love and longing for his son. And so he gathered up his robes and he ran to his son. And with the stench and the dirt of the pig still on his son, he throws his arms round him and says, "You're home, my son, you're home." He didn't care about the shame. The father was doing a shameful thing by being so weak and accepting this son back again. But this father didn't care. His love for his son was so much bigger than any concern about any shame. Reminds me of what it says about Jesus in Hebrews 12, verse 1. It says we keep our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. And listen to this. Because of the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, disregarding the shame. He endured the cross, disregarding the shame. The shame and humiliation of the cross for Jesus was eclipsed by the joy of knowing that because of his sacrifice, because he died to pay the price for our sin, one day he would be able to welcome sinners into the family of God. What reckless love. What amazing grace. And then, right from the centre of that embrace, the son speaks to his father and he says, "I'm not worthy to be called your son." Notice at this point, he has now abandoned his way. Because he doesn't go on and say, "Oh, make me your hired servant." He just acknowledges, "I'm not worthy to be your son." He's abandoned his own agenda and he just throws himself on the mercy and grace of his father. And what does the father do? I love this. The father says, "Quick, go and get a robe and put it on him." This is a sign of a son, an honoured son. He puts shoes on his feet. Now, only a son would have been allowed to wear shoes. Only family members were allowed to wear shoes. The servants, the hired hands, they had to go barefoot. And so it was a sign again of sonship. And then, this is such a beautiful thing, he puts a ring on his finger. That ring gives the son authority to go about his father's business. How amazing is that? How gracious is that? When his son has wasted half the inheritance, he comes back and the father immediately puts a ring on his finger and says, "I have a job for you. You can go about my business. You're my son." And he throws a party to celebrate that the son has come home. Now, as the people are listening, this would have been music to the ears of the tax collectors, the sinners who were gathered there. I imagine maybe they were standing thinking, well, if God looks for the one that has fallen between the cracks, the one that is out on their own, the one who has done such shameful, shameful things, if there's a place at the Father's table for them, maybe there is for me too. There is. God longs to welcome you to his table. But Jesus hadn't finished the story yet, because there's another son. And often we stop the story at that point. Prodigal son home, all done and dusted. Great. But actually, Jesus is just building up to the climax of this story. This son had stayed at home with the father, the older son. But he's not at the table where a son would normally be. In fact, he's out working in the fields with the slaves. And when he comes near the house, he is furious to find that the father has thrown a party to welcome back his wayward brother. And he refuses to come in. And so the father goes out. How beautiful is that? God always takes the initiative. He always comes to meet us. Jesus always looks for the lost. The Father is always looking for the lost. This son was living in the family, but clearly he had lost his way too. And so the Father comes out to meet him. He is not the bad, wayward son, but somehow, sadly, he ends up the villain of this story. Nobody wants to be this guy. This bitter, cynical, angry, jealous, judgmental guy. I imagine when he was younger, he wouldn't have wanted to be that guy either. I think of this young man when he was young, maybe a child, and looking up to his dad and wanting to be just like his dad. And the pride of the day when his dad put that ring on his finger and said, "You can go about my business." The joy of being allowed to go about with his father, doing his business. But somehow, over the years, that changed. And his delight in being the son turned into duty and even drudgery. And listen to his whining to the father. "I've done everything right. I've always obeyed you, and you've never given me anything." Now, obviously, that wasn't true. He had the shoes of sonship on his feet. He had the ring on his finger. He would have had a robe as well. He had all the inheritance to look forward to. Clearly, he had everything, but he couldn't see it. And notice, the father doesn't say to him, "I see all you've done and I honour you for it." He doesn't do that. The father gets right to the root of the problem and he says, "You're my son. You're my son." He wasn't a bad son. He just forgot who he was. He just forgot who he was and whose he was. This was the tragedy of a son behaving as if he was a slave. And he was missing out on the joy of celebrating at the Father's table because he was working and working and working to try and earn the approval and love of his Father when he already had it. How tragic is that? And this part of the story was very much directed at the religious leaders, and I wonder, did they see themselves in this son who was so caught up in his duty, he forgot about the incredible grace and kindness of the Father. And I remember the day that I saw myself in this story. And I saw myself in that older son. And I'll tell you, that wasn't comfortable at all, but it was a time that Jesus reached into my life and spoke to me very clearly and turned things right side up. Because I had forgotten who I was and whose I was. I was going through a very difficult time. It was painful, it was hurtful, and I found myself crying to God just like that older son did. I haven't done anything wrong. I've obeyed you. Why don't you step in and do something? And as I read this story, God gently reminded me, you're my child. You're my child. I'd forgotten the delight and joy and blessing of just being his. And when I saw myself again, reflected in the eyes of my Father, who loves me, not because of what I do for him or when I do the right thing. He loves me just because I'm his, just because I'm his child. When I allowed myself to be guided by my Father into the table, to be nurtured and blessed by my Father, then honestly all the other circumstances I was going through at the time just paled into insignificance. It didn't matter anymore. It didn't matter anymore what was going wrong or what the circumstances were or what people were saying. I saw myself in his eyes. And it was amazing. And the peace that flooded my soul when I came home again to my Father. Listen to what is Jesus, God's desire for us, for our lives. It's in Matthew 11, and I'm reading from the Message. I just love this version. Jesus says, are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Not for me, work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Do you want that? Do you want that this morning? To learn to live freely and lightly with Jesus. As the Father's child, not as a slave. Jesus doesn't finish his story. He leaves it up in the air. We don't know if the older son yielded to the loving embrace of his father or not, because it's a choice. It's always a choice. God doesn't impose his will on us. The younger son could have stayed away as long as he wanted. He could have died away in that far country if that had been his choice. And the older son could have hardened his heart again and gone out to the fields, the tragedy of a son behaving like a slave. The longing of the Father God is that we come home. That is why he is desperately searching for lost ones. He loves us with a love that is so overwhelming, we can never even imagine it. And so the challenge that I want to leave with you this morning is, do you see yourself in any of these stories? The sheep who didn't even realize he was lost. The coin just fell between the cracks. Maybe the willful, rebellious son who wanted to live his life on his terms, or the son who has forgotten who he is and whose he is, and is no longer living as a son. For all of us, the message is God loves you. He sees you. He knows you. He loves you. And it's a love that caused him to sacrifice himself in order to find you and bring you home. Come home. Come home now to the embrace of the Father. Find your purpose, your peace, and your fulfillment in him. Learn to live freely and lightly the abundant life that he has for you. Not just in this world, but also in the next. Come to the Father. We sing that song sometimes. Oh, come to the altar. What is it? The Father's arms are open wide. For all of us this morning, the call is come home. Even if you've just wandered a wee bit, come back home to the embrace of the Father. Come back home and sit at his table. Come back home. Allow him to nurture you and bless you. See yourself again reflected in his eyes, loved and blessed. Come home this morning. Thanks, Josh.
We're going to respond to what Susie has brought there. Thank you, Susie. And as we do, as we sing, I'm going to invite you to stand. If you want to sit and just reflect, and if you're in a place where you need to come home or want to come home or feel like you've wandered astray or fallen through cracks, please take this time now in the word of your heart to do that. But also please take the opportunity to do it with someone else. And yeah, let's respond.